Hey guys, here's another video of John 30, John Answer 30, whatever I've named my channel. This is a sort of a little bit of a random bits video. Don't mind the things on the ground. It's only what's on top of this fridge, well, freezer. Well, here's something I got recently in a trade, an old 1930s electric radiant heater. Solid. What parts that aren't sheet aluminum, or what parts that aren't cast aluminum, are sheet aluminum. So basically the front and rear panel is sheet aluminum, and the rest of it's cast. No switch, cloth wire cord, and one of the oldest cords I've seen, I think, in a long time. And it just hooks into the bottom. I've got a Romex security clamp on the bottom to hold the wire instead of the original porcelain wire holder. And then this telegraph here, this didn't come with it. I got this telegraph and a piece of wood for $2. I mean, piece of wood don't really matter. The telegraph does, because if I'm not mistaken, I'm assuming it's around a 1940s Navy fireproof telegraph key. And it works. I've made basically a wired telegraph system that uses a 3-wire system. Right here, this is the power for transmit, and this one here is the power for receive. So when I hit this right here, the speaker makes a noise, and then the green is just used as a common, or the green, it's used as common power for this side of the unit. So this here makes this click. This one here makes this beep. It's basically a really simple form of communications. It's wired, of course, which means you can't really do too much with it. Now, back in the day, around, I'd say, when it really was big and booming, I'd say around 1860s, 1870s, back during the Civil War and a little bit afterwards. So basically, we're here in Tennessee, East Tennessee. So if we wanted to send a telegraph, let's say North Carolina or someplace like that, they would basically have like a set of power lines dedicated just to it. In fact, that was mostly what power lines were for, was providing power for a telegraph. It's a very primitive type of telecommunications. Alright, let's say tel, the prefix of the word. Tel stands for, like, telephone. Let's say telephone. That stands for a long distance contact through a set of wires. Like you see those power lines over there. The very bottom line, that's cable and phone lines. So that right there would be telephone. So you could be here in your home and you can make a call. Well, nowadays you can make a call all the way around the world. It would cost you quite a bit of money, especially if you did it on landline. But you could make a call. Nowadays we have these little special things called cell phones that use wireless power, or not wireless power, wireless RF signals and transmits to a radio tower. And then after a while, once they had developed their, here in the United States, Marconi Radio Company, I think that was something they developed after they come up with radio, but one of the first primitive styles of radio communication was telegraph, wireless telegraph, and it used basically a big DC transformer that stepped from around 110 volts DC up to like several thousand volts. Like, I'm not sure, I was thinking it was around 10,000 volts DC, and it was hooked up to an antenna, and it would broadcast across a broad spectrum of channels, frequencies. But ever since tubes come around, very, very early teens, when tube radios were starting to be produced, and at first they were for commercial use. Then after a while, around the 20s and 30s, they started mass producing radios. And look, I'm just going by what I know, so some of the stuff isn't exactly up to date and correct. I'll say that now. But around the 20s and 30s, when they started mass producing radios, if I'm not mistaken, one of the first public broadcasts was a commercial for, I think, laundry detergent. I think. And then from there, it just took off. It soared. Everybody that could afford it was getting radios. It was just something that everybody wanted. Nowadays, well, see, back in the early teens of the 20th century, Marconi, when he invented the spark gap radio, that led to a massive boom in advancing technologies, and now we have what we have now. The United States government, they can say right now, they're probably looking at me through a satellite, and they have such massive detail with these satellites and cameras and telescoping cameras and everything that are fixed to satellites. They can see me from a long distance without actually coming around me. So somewhere beyond, like just within the stratosphere, up in the sky, they could be watching me from a camera, a telescoping camera. But besides the point, that first initial creation of the spark gap radio from Marconi, it led to a big massive boom in radios. And around the late teens, early 20s, they come out with tube radios. They eventually started mass producing them. Like I said before, it led to a massive boom. Then they started developing tube radios, and around the late 50s, early 60s, they went from tubes, like the little small radios you find, the tube transistor radios. They went from tubes to transistor radios. And then around the late 60s, like all the base station stuff that you would have at home, like the big stereos and your TVs, when everybody had a massive stock of tubes, but they also ordered transistors, they were making conversion sets. So like some of your TVs and your radios would have transistors and tubes. But around the late 70s, early 80s is when tubes had completely gone out of style and everything was transistorized, solid state. I gotta admit, I'm not a very big fan of solid state. Yes, it does a lot of things like cell phones. I couldn't have a cell phone without transistors, but then again, sometimes phones cause issues and I don't want a phone, which that's actually kind of often. But one of the first radios were the spark gap radio. Then they made the tube radio, the vacuum tube radio. And then they went to transistorized radios, and there's even some radios that don't have transistors or tubes at all, like the Crystal set. It's an AM band radio. You can only really pick up the AM frequencies. Like back then, AM was used for everything, anywhere from music to news, to weather updates, to everything like that. And then around the 50s and on into the 60s, FM started becoming broadly used. And in between the 40s, or in between the 50s until now, FM has changed, or AM and FM band have broadly changed. Now radios are starting to kind of head down the hill and go out of hit out of fashion, technological fashion. But AM is coming to the point that the only thing it's really used for is old classic music, which I gotta admit, one channel or one type of music I do like to listen to that's on there is like the really old classic rock from like the late 50s, early 60s and stuff, and classic country. I like those two genres of music. I'm not good with words. I like those two genres of music, and they have both of those on there, except some of that classic rock that they have is like stuff that's not exactly my taste. But either way, this is Random Bits number 1. Thank you guys for watching, and see you all later.